Chinese President Xi Jinping and United States President Donald Trump engage in a lengthy telephone conversation. What progress did they make on China-US relations? And a setback for President Trump on his travel ban, impacting 7 Muslim-majority nations. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Donald Trump's travel ban to the United States, directed at 7 Muslim-majority nations, suffered a hit in the U.S. courts this week. We'll talk about that later in the show, but we begin with that telephone conversation late Thursday between China's leader Xi Jinping and the U.S. leader, in which Donald Trump agreed to respect the long-time One China policy. Joining me here in the studio is Chunman Zhang. He is a Chinese expert in international relations, and he's a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us is Rico Doss. He is a Mansfield fellow, and he's an expert in Northeast Asia issues. With us too is Afshin Molavi. He is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute. Also joining us from our newsroom is CGTN correspondent Nathan King. Welcome to all of you to the show. Nathan, let me start with you. What can you tell us about this telephone call between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and President Trump?
Well, it's happened. There was a lot of discussion in the press, especially here, about when it would happen. But the fact is that it happened. It was long. It was cordial. Both sides agreed to that. Secondly, of course, everyone in Beijing and here was waiting to see what President Trump would say about the One China policy. Remember, as President-elect, there had been some questions about whether the US would adhere to nearly 40 years of diplomatic protocol and the bedrock of US-China relations by adhering to it after the phone call with the leader in Taiwan, after several Twitter messages about why should we adhere to this without negotiating it. But the readout of the phone call from the White House and from Beijing looked very boilerplate when it came to a new president coming in and reiterating the One China policy, that is a sovereign China, People's Republic of China. So we'll have to see where we go from here, but after all the sort of back and forth and column inches on this, it looks like the Donald Trump administration is like every other administration that we've seen since the end of the 1970s.
Right, Chunman Zhang, President Trump had a meeting today with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who's visiting Washington right now. They held a press conference afterwards, and at that press conference, President Trump addressed that telephone call with President Xi Jinping. Let's take a listen to part of what President Trump had to say about that call. Let's watch.
It was a very, very warm conversation. I think we are on the process of getting along very well, and I think that will also be very much of a benefit to Japan. So we had a very, very good talk last night and discussed a lot of subjects. It was a long talk, and we are working on that as we speak. We have conversations with various representatives of China. I believe that will all work out very well for everybody, China, Japan, the United States, and everybody in the region.
So, Chairman, the question is, how important is it for China that Trump has agreed to this One China policy?
So the call is very important. I want to point out that Mr. Trump is a phone call person. He's not only people know that he's a Twitter person, he likes tweeting stuff, but also he's a phone call person. Right. Soon after taking office, he has made more than a dozen phone calls with leaders around the world, including Canadian Prime Minister, Mexican President, French President, Indian Prime Minister, Australian Prime Minister, but there's no call between Beijing and Washington, D.C. Why? I think the reason is not because Trump didn't want to make the call. It's because Beijing refused to make the call or refused to get the call. Because Trump, as mentioned, last year during after campaign, he received a call from the leader of Taiwan. That's very unorthodox. Also, he publicly questioned the One China policy. But that, I think, will offend Beijing and make Beijing decide that I'm not going to have an official conversation with you unless you make it clear that you, the new administration, will honor the One China policy, because that's the foundation of the China-U.S. relationship.
So are you saying then that this telephone call was initiated by the White House? They reached out to China.
They reached out about their, I think there must be something already arranged before the call. Because they need to make sure Beijing will be happy to receive that call, right? Otherwise, if you call people don't answer it, that'll be a problem, right? So Beijing should be clear that during the call, Trump will make it clear that the new administration will honor the one China policy.
Okay, Rico, there was a great deal of concern that Trump might change this long-standing one China policy and that he might see it in some different way. Now that he's clarified the position, is that going to be seen in very positive terms, not just by the foreign policy establishment here in Washington, but by Beijing as well?
I think it will. I think the talk about missteps and self-inflicted wounds, I think the new administration started out shooting itself in the foot and kind of making a mess of things when there are some other things that they wanted to focus on, like the economy, like jobs, the things that the president promised his supporters and promised America, and yet you have a series, as a colleague referred to, tweets, and he also seemingly, without explanation, decided to embark on a new policy with our second, third largest trading partner, China, and against the backdrop of mentioning during the election that Japan and South Korea might want to think about getting nuclear weapons. Not the way you want to start out when you're talking about the fastest growing continent and about a third of American exports. And so I think that people will see this as a positive and kind of a righting of the ship, so to speak.
There was some speculation, Rico, a few weeks ago, and the speculation came from actually a former United States ambassador talking to the media here in Washington, in which he said that Trump's decision to take this call from the leader of Taiwan was actually a testing China. Let's see how far we can push this.
I'm not in that room, and but I can only imagine that a lot of the, I guess, supporters of Trump said that this was a way to, as you say, test China and let them know that there's a new sheriff in town. Well, the new sheriff, again, probably would like to have some of that back. And with respect to Taiwan, you obviously have some very complex issues. And from my time over there in both China and Taiwan, it's something that you want to really think through. And before you embark on upsetting some well-settled norms, as particularly with regard to the one China policy.
Yeah, Afshin, complex certainly, but also Trump has in many ways behaved very unpredictably. You know, we haven't seen some of these things coming, as our other guests have pointed out here as well, that he's used Twitter to make some of his views known, some important foreign policy views known, coming through tweets. But how significant is it that these two leaders have held a very lengthy conversation?
It's very significant, and if you juxtapose that with the visit of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and what President Trump said about that visit, the breaking news here, Anand, is over the past 24 hours, a conventional Asia foreign policy has broken out in the Trump administration. I mean, this is Washington playbook conventional policy. You respect the one China policy. You, in front of the Japanese Prime Minister, you underscore the importance of the Japan Security Alliance. And so what has happened just in the past 24 hours is we're seeing conventional Washington playbook foreign policy towards Asia. And let's not forget that Secretary Mattis also in his trip to Asia, he underscored again the Japan alliance and the South Korea alliance. And I think all sides are comfortable with that. That's the jigsaw puzzle that they all understand. I don't think President Xi Jinping wants Donald Trump to have a confrontational relationship with Japan, just as much as Prime Minister Abe doesn't want Donald Trump to have a confrontational relationship with China. Let's not forget Japan and China also have a very large trading relationship.
Right, so it's become a little less predictable.
That's right, yeah.
Nathan, looking at this telephone conversation, as I said, it's a lengthy telephone conversation these two leaders had. They cleared the air in many ways. Does it pave the way for more substantial talks on big issues that they want to talk about, things like the South China Sea, trade?
This was the beginning, definitely not the end. And look, a lot of things were said in the campaign that will still worry China. The rhetoric that we played in that clip from Donald Trump when he was with Prime Minister Abe of Japan was definitely, boilerplate Washington. But what about these tariffs that we've been talking about and hearing, 45% tariffs on Chinese goods? What about currency manipulation? What about the South China Sea? Remember, Rex Tillerson's confirmations hearings here in Washington raised a lot of eyebrows across Asia about when the U.S. may intervene in the South China Sea. A lot of that has gone by the wayside since Donald Trump has become the president, not president-elect. But still, we haven't seen the flesh on the bones of these policies. And just in my conversations here around Washington, there seems to be a split within the administration between those who would like to see a more confrontational approach to China and the so-called sort of Goldman Sachs lobby that have invested in China, that have worked with China over the last 10, 15 years, and understand that a win-win cooperation movement of both capitals together actually will bear the most fruit going forward. So I don't think the debate has actually stopped within the Trump administration and won't stop until we know the policies.
All right, Chunman, Nathan mentioned the confirmation hearings for the new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Right. He had some very tough words at that confirmation hearing. He said, and I'm quoting here, he said, "We're going to have to send China a clear signal that first, the island building stops," he's talking about the South China Sea, "and second, your access to those islands also is not going to be allowed." Is this going to be a big issue between these two countries?
I think the Secretary of State, Tillerson, is a hardliner in the South China Sea.
Although the comments have been tempered after that.
But still, I think, as you mentioned, the South China Sea actually has been a big issue in the U.S.-China relationship for a long period of time, not just in the recent time. Actually, it's important in the past before. I think is even maybe more important in today. And for the future, I still think because there are different understandings of the issue there, U.S. and China still have a lot of trouble dealing with the South China Sea.
Okay, Rico, I want to move on to the visit by the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to Washington. Met with President Trump. They went off to Florida this afternoon. Apparently they're going to be playing golf this weekend.
We weren't invited.
We weren't invited, no. But getting down to the serious side of this visit, what do you think are the priorities for these two leaders?
The priority for, first, as an American, for Trump is, again, getting back, a reset of things, getting back to, as Afshin said, some convention, getting back to the norms that underlie this and undergird this relationship between us and Japan, but also Asia writ large. And it's important to note that as Ambassador and Senator Mansfield said, the U.S.-Japan relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. And I think that's the take that President Abe has. And his goal, I think, is to reassure the Japanese citizenry, the people in Kasumi Gaseki, the diplomatic apparatus, that the relationship will continue as it has, and hopefully grow. And hopefully this will spurn a kind of a TPP point 2.0, some form of a bilateral trade agreement that can come out of this. And again, addressing the tariffs. Hopefully that's something that will be looked at a great deal before you start. Really, what you don't want, and the Goldman Sachs lobby, as you alluded to, they want predictability, they want certainty. And and if you say the word tariff, sets off a trade war. You don't want a trade war with China, Japan, or anyone else for that matter. And he has other priorities. And I think Abe, as you alluded to in the introduction, his Prime Minister Kishi played golf with President Eisenhower. He wants to let the Japanese people know and let China know, let North Korea know, we're still good friends. The president hugged him getting out of the car today. So if nothing says friendship hugging the Prime Minister of Japan as he alights out of the car.
Chunman, how would China be looking at this? I mean, besides a trade issue, there was a sort of recommitment by President Trump here to this kind of defense alliance with Japan as well.
Well, I think although the Chinese President Xi Jinping is not here, but Beijing definitely will watch closely to Abe's visit.
Okay.
Because it's so important, not just for Japan-U.S. relationship, but also for there are a lot of implications for China. China and Japan are neighbors, and there are some territory disputes, right, over Diaoyu, Senkaku Islands. And the U.S. Made it clear that the U.S. defense of Japan will include that disputed islands. But that makes China is very cautious about what Abe has discussed with Trump.
Okay, Afshin, very quickly, I want to go to a break, but I want to get your view on this. This is the second meeting these two leaders have had since Trump won the election, rather. Would Trump be trying to play Japan off against China?
You know, I think, you know, as the ultimate deal maker, he probably sees it in that fashion. But I think what he needs to do is be very careful. I think I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a more conventional Asia foreign policy emerging because, you know, we're talking about nearly 2/3 of the world's population living in Asia. Very important export market. In fact, you can actually make an argument that if you have an America First policy, you better get Asia right. Because there's a whole lot of jobs that are being generated from the exports to Asia. Okay, we're going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, another big story. We'll discuss the latest on President Trump's efforts to impose a travel ban to the U.S. that would impact 7 Muslim majority countries. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.